Hello and welcome to this interview where I am interviewing Dan French, founder and CEO of Consider, as part of the series of interviews that I've been having with Dan, really talking about control and compliance, risk, KPIs and key exception indicators. And today, in this fourth chapter, I am talking to Dan about exception analytics, which is really weaving together the three themes that we covered in the three earlier chapters and concluding this discussion today focusing on exception analytics. So hello, Dan.
Hi, Susie.
Let's kick off with what is exception analytics exactly and why should a shared services leader actually care about it?
Right, well, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of activity around data analytics in general in business and also particularly at the front end of the cycle, the revenue cycle, the customer cycle for businesses. But more and more we're starting to see that within shared services as well. The point is that most data analytics is focused on trending and general information about outcomes. We talked before about performance indicators. And exception analytics is about looking at the things that can go wrong. Now, whether or not it's about having a formalized method of identifying where things are going wrong, fixing them early so that the organization can focus on moving to be the best they can possibly be in their world. So whether or not there are exceptions around financial control and compliance, whether there are exceptions about broader risks associated with waste and error, whether it's to do with performance improvement around processes, what we need to do is we define the exceptions, drive out those exceptions, work out the root causes, fix them, so we've got a better and better process. So it's essentially the basis of lean thinking. I know a lot of organizations take a lean approach to performance improvement.
Mm-hmm. So if a shared services organization were to have their exception analytics methodology set up in the most ideal manner, what would that methodology or infrastructure look like?
Well, what they would have is a good understanding of, in the three areas we discussed already, that the areas that they want to optimize. So financial control and compliance areas, what are the points that they're most concerned about exceptions occurring? In terms of the risks we talked about, which are related to waste and error, which was quite closely related. And in terms of process improvement, we talked about key performance indicators and key exception indicators. So monitoring those key exception indicators so you can drive improvement and cost reduction in the processes. That's what's needed. Typically, the first point is an organization takes a narrow path through one of those and on one particular process to establish how exception analytics works for them and what stakeholders need involved and how do they make the process improvement decisions. And then they would typically roll it out to one, two, or three of those themes to act as their continuous improvement platform.
We're finding at Shared Services Link that there is a big focus on analytics by shared services organisations. It's something that the business wants. As far as the analytics function that are now being set up by shared services organisations, sometimes with 600, 700 people managing information, so there'll be management information, if you will, and analytics, where does this sit? Does it sit with them? Does it sit with the shared services people in particular?
That's another interesting question. I think it depends on the organization, the culture, and the structure. But typically, to do exception analytics well, you need to have process experts. So typically, the process owner is a key owner of the activity, or key stakeholder. But also, you need to have some involvement from those people that understand the underlying system, so the ERP system. And you need to have good analytics people who understand about exceptions and monitoring for them. So typically, that group either is in a specific group in shared services or in management information, or it is a virtual team that crosses those.
Mm-hmm. And if we've just focused on the technology used to gather, but also, and I'll come on to the technology in just a moment, but also the frequency again, with what regularity should the owner of this process or this activity be examining the exception report?
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and that really depends on the time that the process owner is going to spend on managing exceptions. So depending on what else is going on, typically you'll find a process owner say, okay, there'll be one time a week I'm going to dig into what's going wrong in our processes. There might be one time a week, it might be one time every 2 weeks, but depending on the business. And there's no point producing exception analytics that somebody isn't going to be looking at. So you time your exception analytics with the activity of root cause analysis. Now, some people argue that you should do this on an absolutely continuous basis, and every time an exception turns up, it should pop up. The reality is that, as humans, we're not very good at interrupt-driven work. You get one exception and go and have a look at it. It's the email problem. You dealing with one email takes a lot of time because you've got to filter out all the other stuff. It'd be much better to have the batch of those alerts and look at them and say, okay, this is all issue to do with payment processing. Let's understand why that's happening. Let's talk to people. Let's get to the root cause, and let's either train people, change the policy, or change the process, or some other way ensure this doesn't happen.
So looking at the technology piece then, is the exception analytics report something that can be easily got from your ERP, or is this something that people need to have access to through a bolt-on application that can provide a really nice dashboard to let them know where their exceptions are taking place? How does that work?
Well, a lot of it is dependent on the skills and resources you have at hand. I think most of the ERP vendors have ways of programming these kind of reports. It can be time-consuming, it can require some sort of fairly heavy-duty skill sets, or there's some bolt-on applications which are slightly more intuitive for people to use for data analytics, and there's a growing band of kind of cloud-based analytics tools. I mean, the key thing is to get an analytics methodology, which includes both the technology used and the way in which you do it, and how you manage that process improvement, develop that which works for you based on the issues you have at hand, the skills you have, and the kind of organization you are. And I think, if you have access to lots of technical people who understand the specific ways of coding analytics in the ERP, then fine, use that. It can be time-consuming. A lot of organizations find it's better to use something slightly more independent they can use more dynamically.
Could you give an example of what life looks like when a shared services organization doesn't get this bit right?
The examples are basically that from control and compliance, you suddenly find, usually you get a new audit team in, and somebody does some work at audit time and says, you do realize that 10% of the controls you think are working aren't even working. Or you find that people are saying, you do realize you're processing a load of duplicates. Or in terms of performance improvement, you find that you're managing along to your performance indicators with being quite happy, and then one day you wake up and realize you're not providing a good service and your overall costs are out of whack. So the challenge with it is, what happens to organizations who don't apply this is they feel quite comfortable for a period of time and then suddenly get hit in the face with something reasonably unpleasant because it's a build-up of not having inspected this stuff for quite some time. So what we often see, we often get called into organizations who've had either an unpleasant experience, an executive has suddenly realized something's going wrong, or they've had an external audit or some kind of customer audit who's come in and said, hang on, this isn't as advertised at all. And then all of a sudden there's a panic and said, well, what are we going to do about that? So I think the danger is it can be quite easy to say, well, our performance indicators look okay, I'm reasonably happy with that, let's carry on. The problem is you don't know what's lurking beneath the surface, and this is exception analytics is about making sure you avoid the icebergs.
Your closing comment, if you will, Dan, on really just weaving together the 4 areas that we've covered in these 4 chapters. So the control and compliance piece, the risk piece, KPIs and key exception indicators, and exception analytics. If we were just to kind of wrap all of those 4 themes up, and if you could offer your closing thoughts on some best practices or some recommendations that you would leave as your closing words to the shared services market, what would they be?
Okay. Well, if you get back to first principles, we're all driving to some form of world-class capability, or certainly best-in-class capability for our organization in finance and shared services. And that means we've got to help the organization drive the business results we want. We've got to drive down the cost of finance somewhere towards 0.5% of revenue. We've got to optimize cash flow, and we've got to have effective risk management. So in those, we talked about financial control and compliance. Clearly, we want to make sure that that is both cost-effective and managing risk effectively. In terms of the broader risks of waste and error, that affects cash flow, it affects risk, and it also affects cost of finance. In terms of performance improvement for processes and key exception indicators, that is a big part of cost of finance. So it's all about, on the standardization and simplification agenda that's central to shared services, this whole issue of understanding what can go wrong is definitely the key drive to get us to the next step of performance. And I would say, as a shared services leader, if you're not doing this stuff yet, you need to work out of those 3 areas, control and compliance, broader risk in the waste and error area, or process improvement, what are the area that's the highest priority to you right now? And that might just be because of what you observe, but that doesn't matter. And then you should drive through some kind of short, sharp, narrow path pilot activity to prove the value of some kind of exception analytic approach to build into what is your methodology for continuous improvement, getting you to be the best you can be in your segment.
Dan French, founder and CEO of Consider. Many thanks indeed. If you would like to find out more about Consider or indeed get in contact with Dan French, please go to their website, www.consider.biz. Thank you very much, and we look forward to welcoming you next time. Goodbye.